Lydia Caldwell's body surfaced in the Sweetwater Creek on the morning of August 3, 1852, her silk dress billowing like a ghostly sail beneath the current. The woman who had wielded a whip over 20 enslaved souls would never give another order. This is the story of how one woman's suffering became the Colorado Territory's most carefully guarded secret, buried deeper than the graves in the parched earth beyond town limits. The dawn light that morning cast long shadows across the water where washerwomen had scrubbed linens for generations, their hands raw from lye soap and endless labor. Lydia's porcelain face stared upward through the murky water, her mouth frozen in the silent scream that the creek would never release. Before we trace this dark current to its source, tell me where you're watching from. Drop a comment with your location and the time where you are right now. And if stories like this grip your soul, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened in the Colorado Territory that summer has been hidden in dusty records for over 170 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The discovery sent shockwaves through a community already divided by tensions that had been simmering since the territory opened to settlement 3 years prior. Lydia Caldwell had been the most prominent figure in Thornhill Crossing, a small settlement nestled between the Rocky Mountains and the endless prairie. Her husband, cattle baron Joseph Taylor, owned half the grazing land within 50 miles, and his wife's iron will had shaped the social hierarchy of every family that depended on his wealth for survival. Now she lay dead, and the circumstances whispered of something far darker than accidental drowning. Cole Freeman, the settlement's appointed lawman, examined the scene with the careful attention of a man who understood that unexplained deaths could tear fragile communities apart. The creek where Lydia had been found showed signs of struggle, disturbed mud along the banks suggesting something violent had occurred in this place where women came daily to perform their endless domestic labor. Branches hung low over the water, their leaves creating shadows that danced across the surface like specters unwilling to depart. From the Thornhill Crossing Settlement Records, August 3, 1852, Mrs. Lydia Caldwell found deceased in Sweetwater Creek. Circumstances require investigation. No witnesses to her morning walk. Inquiry proceeding under authority of Marshal Freeman. Lydia had established a pattern over the 3 years since arriving in the Colorado Territory, walking each morning to oversee the enslaved women who washed her household's endless supply of linens and clothing. The ritual served multiple purposes. It demonstrated her authority, reminded the women of their place, and allowed her to inspect their work for any imperfection that might justify punishment. Servants at the Taylor Ranch House on Copper Ridge confirmed she had left at her customary time, 6 o'clock in the morning, carrying her riding crop and parasol. The parasol was found tangled in creek vegetation 20 yards downstream, its delicate fabric torn as if someone had grabbed it during a struggle. The riding crop lay half submerged in shallow water near the bank, its leather grip showing marks that suggested it had been wrenched from a tight grasp. But it was the bruises on Lydia's wrists that made Marshal Freeman remove his hat and stare at the mountains, as if seeking answers from peaks that had witnessed countless human dramas without offering judgment. What the official records didn't document was the figure several ranch hands claimed to have glimpsed that morning. A woman in a faded blue dress, standing motionless among the cottonwood trees as if waiting for something inevitable to arrive. When questioned for details, the witnesses grew uncertain, their descriptions shifting like heat mirages on summer prairie. The woman they might have seen moved through Thornhill Crossing like a ghost, present but unnoticed, essential to daily life but invisible in the ways that mattered to those who considered themselves civilized. Her name was Nadira, though the Taylor household rarely used it, preferring generic terms that reduced her humanity to her function. She had arrived in the Colorado Territory 2 years earlier, sold to Joseph Taylor by a slave trader passing through on his way to California. Her skin marked her as property in a land where such distinctions determined whether you lived free or died in chains. Her intelligence made her dangerous in ways that Lydia Caldwell had recognized immediately and sought to crush with systematic cruelty. The Taylor Ranch House on Copper Ridge dominated the landscape like a monument to wealth extracted from land and labor. Whitewashed walls reflected the harsh mountain sunlight, while glass windows imported at great expense from St. Louis demonstrated prosperity that few in the territory could match. The smell of baking bread and wood smoke drifted from the kitchen, where enslaved women worked from before dawn until long after the Taylor family retired to their comfortable beds. Nadira had learned to move through these spaces without making sounds that might draw attention, her presence acknowledged only when her labor was required. Her position as the household's primary laundress gave her access to information that accumulated like coins in a hidden purse. She knew which debts Joseph Taylor struggled to pay, which neighbors he cheated in cattle deals, which secrets Lydia guarded with the ferocity of someone whose respectability rested on foundations more fragile than they appeared. Settlement gossip can be more cutting than winter wind. The women of Thornhill Crossing gathered regularly for quilting circles and church socials, their conversations mapping the complex relationships that connected every household through bonds of obligation and resentment. They spoke carefully around the subject of the Taylor family's enslaved workers, treating the institution of slavery as if it were weather, an unchangeable fact of existence that required no moral examination. Lydia had cultivated her position at the center of this social web with calculated precision. Her Eastern education and refined manners set her apart from the rough frontier women who had arrived in covered wagons, while her husband's wealth provided the foundation for influence that extended beyond mere social standing. When Lydia expressed opinions about proper behavior or suitable marriages, other women listened with the deference owed to someone who could make or break a family's reputation with carefully chosen words. But beneath the surface of genteel respectability, tensions had been building like pressure behind a dam. The Compromise of 1850 had left the Colorado Territory's status regarding slavery deliberately vague, creating a situation where the institution existed in legal limbo, recognized by some and rejected by others. Abolition sentiment had been growing among certain segments of the population, while those who profited from enslaved labor defended the practice with increasing desperation. Nadira had watched these debates from the margins, understanding that her fate depended on political decisions made by people who never considered her perspective worth hearing. She had learned to read despite laws prohibiting such education, teaching herself from newspapers left carelessly in rooms she cleaned. The words opened windows onto a world beyond Thornhill Crossing, revealing that the cruelty she endured was neither natural nor inevitable, but a choice made by those who benefited from her suffering. From Joseph Taylor's private correspondence, June 12, 1852. The woman Nadira shows intelligence that exceeds her station. My wife has expressed concerns about her influence on the other servants. We may need to sell her south before she becomes a source of trouble beyond our ability to control. The letter revealed the calculus of human ownership, the casual consideration of selling someone away from everything familiar because her intelligence threatened the comfortable assumptions that allowed slavery to function. Lydia had advocated strongly for this sale, recognizing in Nadira something that frightened her more than open rebellion, the quiet accumulation of knowledge that might someday be weaponized against those who thought themselves untouchable. What neither Lydia nor Joseph understood was that Nadira had been preparing for this moment since the day she first touched the cold water of Sweetwater Creek. The place where she scrubbed their linens until her hands cracked and bled had taught her lessons about patience, about the power of water to wear away stone, about how drowning could look like accident if you understood the current's hidden strength. The morning Lydia's body surfaced, Nadira continued her work with the same steady rhythm she had maintained for 2 years. Her face revealed nothing of the satisfaction that burned beneath her composed exterior, nothing of the calculations that had finally reached their inevitable conclusion. She carried baskets of wet laundry back to the ranch house, hung sheets to dry in the mountain wind, and prepared the evening meal with movements so familiar they required no conscious thought. Hung she, Masti? Would you have noticed her that day? Would you have seen anything beyond a servant performing expected tasks? Or would you have looked past her the way Thornhill Crossing had learned to look past the human cost of their comfortable lives, seeing only what served their purposes while remaining blind to everything else? The Colorado Territory in 1852 existed in a state of perpetual transformation, caught between the lawless freedom of the frontier and the rigid social structures imported from eastern states. Thornhill Crossing had been established 3 years earlier by settlers seeking fortunes in cattle ranching and mining, their ambitions creating a community that reflected both the promise and brutality of westward expansion. The settlement itself consisted of roughly 200 permanent residents, with twice that number passing through seasonally as prospectors, traders, and drifters seeking opportunities in a land that offered wealth to some and graves to many others. Main Street stretched for 3 blocks, lined with businesses that served the practical needs of frontier life. A general store, blacksmith shop, saloon, and the modest church, where Reverend Matthew Moore delivered sermons that carefully avoided controversial topics like slavery that might divide his congregation. The landscape surrounding Thornhill Crossing combined stark beauty with harsh reality. Rocky mountain peaks dominated the western horizon, their snow-capped summits visible even in summer, while endless prairie rolled eastward toward distant horizons that promised either fortune or death depending on luck and preparation. Sweetwater Creek cut through this terrain like a vein of life, providing water for livestock, crops, and the domestic labor that sustained households throughout the region. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The creek itself ran cold and swift during spring snowmelt, slowing to a more manageable current by late summer when women gathered along its banks to perform washing that never seemed to end. Cottonwood trees provided shade from the relentless sun, while flat rocks worn smooth by countless years of water flow created natural washing surfaces. The same spot where Lydia Caldwell's body had been discovered served as the primary location for laundry work, a detail that would acquire terrible significance as the truth of her death slowly emerged. Joseph Taylor had arrived in the Colorado Territory in 1849, part of the initial wave of settlers who claimed vast tracts of grazing land before formal surveys established legal boundaries. His cattle operation sprawled across 15,000 acres, employing a dozen cowboys and maintaining herds that numbered in the thousands. The wealth generated by selling beef to mining camps and military outposts had allowed him to build the finest house in the territory and import a bride from Richmond, whose family connections enhanced his social standing. Lydia had arrived as his wife in the spring of 1850, bringing with her trunks full of fine clothing, furniture shipped at enormous expense across the plains, and expectations about how a proper household should function. The crude reality of frontier life had shocked her initially, but she had adapted by imposing Eastern standards of gentility on a community that had previously operated with more casual social arrangements. Her insistence on formal dinners, proper calling cards, and elaborate social rituals transformed Thornhill Crossing's upper class from rough pioneers into something resembling respectable society. But maintaining these standards required labor, endless hours of cooking, cleaning, sewing, and washing that free women refused to perform at the wages Joseph was willing to pay. The solution, purchased from a slave trader for $800 in gold, arrived in the form of 5 human beings whose lives would be consumed by Lydia's vision of civilized living. From the Journals of Traveling Minister Reggie Bishop, July 1851, the Taylor Ranch maintains several enslaved persons in defiance of growing sentiment against such practices. Mrs. Taylor treats these unfortunates with shocking cruelty, as if their suffering validates her own status. I fear such wickedness will bring judgment upon this entire settlement. The institution of slavery existed in legal ambiguity throughout the Western territories. The Compromise of 1850 had allowed territorial legislatures to decide the question for themselves, but the Colorado Territory had not yet established formal government beyond appointed officials like Marshal Freeman. This created a situation where slavery functioned through custom and force rather than explicit law, sustained by those who profited from it, and tolerated by those who found it distasteful, but not worth confronting. Nadira's arrival in 1850 had been part of Joseph's effort to establish his household as the territorial standard for civilized living. He had purchased her specifically for her intelligence and skills, understanding that maintaining Lydia's standards would require workers capable of learning complex tasks. What he had failed to anticipate was how that intelligence might be turned toward purposes beyond obedience. The other enslaved workers in the Taylor household formed a small community bound by shared suffering and mutual dependence. Hannah Clark, a woman of 40 who served as cook, had been enslaved since birth in Missouri. Her skills in the kitchen made her valuable enough that Lydia treated her with marginally less cruelty than the others. Ella White and Chloe Martinez, both in their 20s, handled housework and childcare, their days consumed by tasks that began before dawn and ended long after the Taylor family retired. These women existed in a state of constant vigilance, learning to anticipate Lydia's moods and avoid the punishments she dispensed for infractions real or imagined. The riding crop she carried during her morning inspections left marks that ached for days, while her words cut deeper than any physical blow, designed to strip away dignity and replace it with the internalized belief that suffering was deserved. Nadira had witnessed countless punishments during her 2 years in the household, each one reinforcing her understanding that mercy would never arrive from external sources. She had watched Ella receive 20 lashes for breaking a plate, seen Chloe locked in the root cellar for 2 days after speaking disrespectfully, heard Hannah's quiet sobs after Lydia threatened to sell her away from the only home she had known for 4 decades. The community of Thornhill Crossing observed these cruelties with varying degrees of discomfort and indifference. Some settlers, particularly those from northern states, expressed private disgust at slavery's brutality while doing nothing to challenge its existence. Others, especially those who had migrated from southern states, defended the practice as necessary for maintaining civilization in savage lands. Most fell somewhere between these extremes, uncomfortable with slavery's worst aspects, but unwilling to sacrifice their own comfort to oppose it. Reverend Moore delivered sermons that emphasized obedience to earthly masters while promising heavenly rewards for patient suffering, theological justifications that allowed his congregation to maintain their faith while participating in a system that reduced human beings to property. His Sunday services drew most of the settlement's respectable families, creating weekly gatherings where social hierarchies were reinforced through careful attention to seating arrangements and post-service conversations. The Taylor family occupied the front pew, their position reflecting both wealth and social standing. Lydia dressed in elaborate gowns that required hours of labor to clean and maintain, her appearance serving as advertisement for the refinement that separated her household from less accomplished families. She listened to Reverend Moore's sermons with expressions of pious approval, nodding at passages about the divinely ordained nature of social hierarchies, while showing no awareness of the contradiction between Christian charity and her treatment of those she claimed to own. What would you have thought sitting in that church and watching Lydia present herself as a model of Christian virtue? Would you have recognized the disconnect between professed faith and practiced cruelty? Or would you have accepted the comfortable lie that slavery could somehow be consistent with religious teachings about human dignity and divine love? The machinery of injustice requires the cooperation of many hands, some wielding whips and others simply looking away. Thornhill Crossing had perfected both forms of participation, creating a community where evil could flourish in plain sight because good people found it easier to maintain silence than to risk their own comfort by speaking truth to power. The morning air on the banks of Sweetwater Creek carried the scent of wet earth and crushed grass, while July sunlight turned the water into liquid gold. Nadira knelt among the flat rocks that generations of women had used for washing, her hands moving through cold water with the automatic precision of someone who had performed this task thousands of times. The rhythm of scrubbing provided a meditation that allowed her mind to wander while her body continued its labor without conscious direction. She had risen at 4 o'clock as required, started fires in the kitchen stove, prepared breakfast for the Taylor family, and carried the first load of laundry to the creek before most of Thornhill Crossing had awakened. Her back ached from bending over washboards, her hands were raw from lye soap that stripped away skin along with dirt, and her shoulders burned from wringing water from heavy linens. The pain had become so familiar that she barely registered it anymore, background sensation that defined existence as surely as breathing. Other women worked along the creek that morning, both enslaved and free, their conversations creating a soundtrack of feminine voices that rose and fell like birdsong. The divisions between slave and free remained stark, even in this shared space, with white women occupying the choice spots where current flowed strongest, while enslaved women made do with whatever locations remained. The social geography of the creek reflected the broader hierarchies that structured every aspect of life in the territory. Hannah Clark worked 10 yards downstream, her strong arms making quick work of the heavy canvas trousers that Joseph Taylor wore while working cattle. She hummed spirituals under her breath, songs that carried coded messages about endurance and eventual deliverance. The melody spoke of rivers crossed and burdens lifted, promises of freedom that existed somewhere beyond the visible horizon. Ella White and Chloe Martinez occupied positions farther down the bank, their younger bodies bent over washing just as Nadira's was, their futures stretching ahead with the same bleak certainty that tomorrow would bring more labor, more pain, more years of serving people who viewed them as equipment rather than humans. They spoke quietly between themselves, sharing observations about which families might be convinced to purchase them if Joseph decided to sell, calculating which masters might prove marginally less cruel than the tailors. The sound of boots on the path brought immediate tension to the enslaved women's postures, their bodies unconsciously preparing for whatever might come next. Lydia Caldwell appeared among the cottonwood trees like a pale ghost materialized from morning mist, her expensive dress impractical for the rough terrain but serving its intended purpose of demonstrating wealth and status. The riding crop swung from her right hand with casual menace, its presence a constant reminder that punishment could arrive without warning or mercy. She surveyed the working women with the expression of someone inspecting livestock for signs of disease or disobedience, her gaze lingering on each figure long enough to create discomfort, but not long enough to suggest actual interest in their humanity. The free women along the creek offered polite greetings that Lydia acknowledged with minimal nods, maintaining the social distance that separated respectable wives from common laborers. When her attention fixed on Nadira, something shifted in the air like pressure dropping before a thunderstorm. Lydia approached the rocks where Nadira worked, her boots clicking against stone with rhythmic precision that matched the beating of a heart laboring under stress. "You're washing those sheets incorrectly," Lydia announced, her voice carrying clearly across the water. "The corners show stains that proper technique would have removed. This laziness is exactly what I've come to expect from someone of your background." Nadira continued her scrubbing without looking up, understanding that eye contact would be interpreted as insolence while protest would confirm accusations of improper attitude. The sheets she was washing showed no stains visible to any objective observer, but objective observation had nothing to do with Lydia's morning inspection. The ritual served purposes beyond laundry quality, establishing dominance through arbitrary criticism that could never be adequately answered. "You will rewash every item you've touched this morning," Lydia continued, warming to her subject with the enthusiasm of someone who had found a legitimate outlet for cruelty. "And you'll receive 10 lashes this evening to remind you that careless work carries consequences. Perhaps pain will teach you what words apparently cannot." The pronouncement fell across the creek like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outward to touch every woman within hearing. The free women found sudden intense interest in their own washing, their eyes carefully averted from a scene that made them uncomfortable but not uncomfortable enough to risk involvement. Hannah, Ella, and Chloe exchanged glances weighted with helpless sympathy, understanding that any protest would only result in their own punishment. From the private diary of Emily Johnson, wife of the settlement's general store owner, July 15, 1852, witnessed Mrs. Taylor discipline her servant at the creek this morning. The woman showed remarkable composure in accepting punishment she almost certainly did not deserve. "I wonder how long such patience can endure before something breaks, either in her spirit or in the world that requires such submission." Nadira finally raised her eyes to meet Lydia's gaze, a gesture of defiance so subtle that it might have been accidental except for the intelligence that burned behind her expression. For 3 seconds that stretched like hours, the two women regarded each other across a divide that encompassed race, class, power, and the fundamental question of what one human being owed another. What Lydia saw in that moment should have warned her, but her confidence in her own invulnerability had been built over years of facing no consequences for casual cruelty. She interpreted Nadira's steady gaze as confirmation of rebellious spirit that required crushing, never considering that she might be staring at someone who had moved beyond fear into the dangerous territory of calculation. "Lower your eyes when I speak to you," Lydia commanded, her voice rising with anger that had less to do with disobedience than with the uncomfortable recognition that this enslaved woman refused to accept the internal submission that was supposed to accompany physical bondage. "You forget your place, and I will ensure you remember it." Nadira returned her attention to the washing, her hands resuming their steady rhythm while her mind began tracing paths that had been forming for months. The creek water flowed past her knees with patient persistence, wearing away stone grain by grain, teaching lessons about the power of sustained pressure applied over time. She had been washing clothes in this creek for 2 years, learning its currents and depths, understanding where the bottom dropped away suddenly, and where hidden roots could trap the unwary. That night in the barn where punishments were administered away from the house's genteel spaces, Nadira received the promised lashes while Joseph Taylor looked on with expressions that mixed discomfort with the pragmatic acceptance that maintaining discipline required occasional violence. The whip's bite registered as pain that she filed away alongside countless other injuries, fuel for the fire that had been building since she first understood that justice would never arrive from external sources. Later, lying on the hard pallet in the small room she shared with Hannah, Nadira stared at rough wooden beams overhead and made her choice. The patient suffering that Reverend Moore preached about had never saved anyone from bondage. Prayer had not stayed Lydia's hand or softened Joseph's heart. Waiting for the world to recognize the evil of slavery had produced nothing except more years of servitude for those whose lives were consumed by waiting. What would you have done in that moment, your back burning from unjust punishment, your future stretching ahead with certainty that tomorrow would bring the same cruelty? Would you have continued enduring in hope that circumstances might improve? Or would you have recognized that some debts could only be settled through actions that civilized society would condemn, but that justice would ultimately require? Hannah's quiet voice came from the darkness, heavy with knowledge earned through 4 decades of bondage. Whatever you're thinking about, be careful. They hang people for the kind of justice we dream about. Nadira didn't answer, but her silence carried more weight than words. She had moved beyond the kind of careful calculation that Hannah advised, past the point where fear of consequences could alter the course she had chosen. The creek would flow as it always had, patient and persistent, wearing away obstacles that seemed solid until the moment they crumbled. Lydia Caldwell had 6 weeks left to walk freely along the banks of Sweetwater Creek, though neither woman knew the precise schedule that fate had established. The machinery of revenge, once set in motion, operates according to its own timeline, waiting for the moment when opportunity aligns with determination to create outcomes that seem inevitable only in retrospect. The kitchen knife balanced perfectly in Nadira's palm as she tested its edge against candlelight, the blade catching reflections that danced across whitewashed walls like spirits waiting to be born. In the pre-dawn darkness of the Taylor Ranch house, surrounded by the tools of daily survival, she began her education in the art of patient observation and careful preparation. What Thornhill Crossing's respectable families never understood was that their enslaved workers saw everything, remembered everything, and forgot nothing that might prove useful when the moment for action finally arrived. The weeks following her punishment passed with the steady rhythm of summer turning toward autumn, each day building upon the previous one like stones stacked to create a wall invisible to those who refused to see it. Nadira continued her assigned tasks with the same mechanical efficiency she had always displayed, her face revealing nothing of the calculations spinning behind her eyes. She woke before dawn to start fires, prepared meals with ingredients she measured and mixed according to recipes she had memorized, carried laundry to the creek where cold water numbed her hands, and endured Lydia's inspections with the quiet composure that her mistress interpreted as proper submission. But submission and planning are not mutually exclusive states, and Nadira had learned to occupy both simultaneously with the skill of someone whose survival had always depended on hiding true thoughts beneath acceptable performances. She began to study patterns with the attention of a scholar preparing for examination, noting details that most people overlooked because they had never needed to view the world as a puzzle requiring solution. Lydia's morning walks to the creek followed a precise schedule that varied by no more than 15 minutes throughout the week. She left the ranch house at 6 o'clock during summer months, walking the quarter-mile path through cottonwood groves and across the small meadow that separated the house from the water. The journey took her 10 minutes at her customary pace, allowing her to arrive just as the enslaved women were settling into their washing work, her timing calculated to maximize the disruption her presence caused. She walked alone despite Joseph's occasional suggestions that she take someone with her for safety. Lydia insisted that her morning inspections required privacy, that the presence of another person would diminish her authority and make the enslaved women less fearful of punishment. This stubborn independence, born from pride and sustained by the confidence that came from facing no consequences for years of cruelty, would prove to be her fatal miscalculation. From the daily journal Nadira kept hidden beneath loose floorboards in her sleeping quarters, August 1, 1852. 3rd week of observation complete. The pattern holds without variation. She arrives at the large flat rock where I work at precisely 6:15 each morning. The current runs strongest where the creek bends around the cottonwood roots. Depth there measures 4 feet at this time of year, increasing to 6 during spring snowmelt. A person caught in that current would struggle to find footing on the rocky bottom. The journal itself represented enormous risk, as enslaved people faced severe punishment for possessing literacy, but Nadira had learned to read and write through careful observation of the Taylor family's correspondence and newspapers left carelessly on tables she cleaned. She practiced letters by scratching them in the dirt behind the barn, memorizing shapes and sounds until they became as natural as breathing. The skill opened windows onto a world beyond Thornhill Crossing, revealing through written words that the cruelty she endured was neither natural nor inevitable. She read abolitionist newspapers that occasionally arrived in the settlement, their inflammatory language describing slavery as a moral evil that demanded immediate action rather than gradual reform. She studied accounts of resistance and escape, learning about the Underground Railroad that helped freedom seekers reach northern states and Canada. Most importantly, she read court records from the settlement's small legal disputes, understanding how justice was administered in the territory and what crimes carried which consequences. The Colorado Territory maintained rough frontier justice that prioritized property rights and social order above individual lives, especially when those lives belonged to people the law classified as property rather than persons. Murder trials were rare and convictions even rarer, particularly when circumstances could be interpreted as accidental death. A drowning in a creek known for treacherous currents would likely be ruled misadventure, a tragic accident that required no deeper investigation unless evidence of foul play was overwhelming. Nadira began testing the creek's currents with the systematic approach of someone conducting scientific experiments. During her washing work, she would release small objects into the water at different points, observing how the current carried them and where they became trapped or sank from view. She learned which rocks provided secure footing and which were covered with algae that made them treacherously slippery. She discovered that the bend where cottonwood roots created a natural hollow beneath the surface was deeper than it appeared from the bank, and that anyone who lost their balance there would find themselves suddenly submerged with no easy way to regain footing. The other enslaved women noticed Nadira's increasing preoccupation with the creek's geography, but said nothing, understanding that knowledge kept private was knowledge that couldn't be used against you. Hannah watched with the awareness of someone who had survived 4 decades by learning when to see and when to pretend blindness. She recognized the signs of someone moving beyond endurance into action. But she also understood that speaking openly about such intentions could endanger everyone involved. Settlement life operated on networks of gossip and observation that connected every household through invisible threads of information. Nadira learned to trace these currents just as she had learned to trace the creek's flow, mapping relationships that determined who held power and who remained vulnerable. She listened during her work in the Taylor household, absorbing conversations that the family conducted as if she were furniture incapable of understanding or remembering their words. Joseph Taylor spoke freely about his business dealings, his voice carrying through the house as he discussed cattle sales and land acquisitions with visiting ranchers. Nadira learned which neighbors he had cheated in transactions, which debts he struggled to repay, which partnerships were failing despite public appearances of success. This knowledge accumulated like coins in a hidden purse, potentially valuable but only if circumstances ever allowed it to be spent. Lydia's conversations with other settlement women revealed different secrets, the kind shared among supposed equals who believed their superiority exempted them from consequences. She complained about servants who failed to meet her standards, criticized neighbors whose households lacked proper refinement, and expressed opinions about which families deserved social recognition and which should be excluded from respectable company. Her words painted a portrait of someone who derived satisfaction from exercising power over others, who needed the visible suffering of inferiors to confirm her own elevated status. The relationship between Joseph and Lydia contained tensions that occasionally erupted into arguments loud enough to be heard throughout the house. He resented the expense of maintaining her standards of gentility, while she despised what she considered his crude frontier manners and lack of proper social graces. They had produced no offspring during 3 years of marriage, a failure that both blamed on the other in private conversations that revealed deeper unhappiness beneath the surface of their public partnership. From a letter Lydia wrote to her sister in Richmond, July 20, 1852. Life in this savage territory grows increasingly unbearable. Joseph cares only for his cattle and profits, while I struggle to maintain even basic standards of civilization. The servants require constant supervision as they lack any natural inclination toward proper behavior. I sometimes wonder if I made a terrible mistake in accepting his proposal, trading the comforts of home for this exile among people who barely qualify as civilized. The letter revealed vulnerability that Lydia never displayed publicly, showing that even those who wielded power with casual cruelty could feel trapped by circumstances they had chosen but grown to regret. Nadira discovered the letter while cleaning Lydia's writing desk, reading it quickly before returning it to its proper place among correspondence that Lydia saved but never sent. The knowledge that her mistress felt imprisoned by her own choices provided no comfort, only confirmation that suffering transcended the boundaries of legal status and that unhappiness was democracy's one true expression in a hierarchical world. As August advanced toward its conclusion, Nadira's preparations reached their final stages. She had memorized every detail of the creek's geography, understood the timing of Lydia's movements with precision that would satisfy a watchmaker, and calculated the minimal actions necessary to create an outcome that would appear accidental to any investigation. The plan required no weapons beyond opportunity, no conspiracy beyond her own determination, no accomplices who might later testify about intentions discussed in moments of weakness. What would you have felt, making such preparations? Would fear have stopped you before the final step, or would the accumulated weight of injustice have pushed you past the point where conventional morality could reach? The distance between thought and action can be measured in inches or miles depending on how much suffering a person has absorbed, before deciding that endurance has limits, and that some debts can only be settled through means that civilized society condemns. Hannah found Nadira sitting by the window long after midnight on August 2nd, staring toward the creek, where morning light would soon bring another day of labor and another opportunity for choice. The older woman settled beside her without speaking, understanding that some silences contained more truth than any words could express. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Hannah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "remember that we are not the ones who made this world cruel. We only responded to cruelty with the tools it provided." Nadira nodded without turning from the window, her reflection in the glass showing a face that had aged beyond its years through experiences that should never have been required of any human being. The girl who had arrived in the Colorado Territory 2 years earlier had been ground away by daily humiliation and systematic brutality, leaving behind someone harder and more dangerous than Lydia Caldwell would ever recognize until the moment recognition arrived too late to matter. The morning of August 3, 1852 arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that the Colorado Territory produced during late summer, when heat had burned away any moisture that might soften the edges of earth and sky. Nadira rose at her customary hour, moving through the dark house with the silent efficiency of someone who had performed these tasks so many times that thought was no longer necessary. Her hands built fires in the kitchen stove, prepared coffee that Joseph would drink while reviewing account books, and arranged the breakfast table with plates and utensils positioned according to standards Lydia had established during her first week in the territory. The routine movements provided camouflage for the anticipation that hummed beneath her skin, like electricity before a storm. Today would either confirm the weeks of preparation or reveal fatal flaws in planning that had seemed flawless during long nights of calculation. The distance between theoretical justice and practical action was about to be measured in minutes rather than months, and there would be no opportunity to reconsider once events began their inevitable progression. She carried the first load of laundry to Sweetwater Creek at 5:30, arriving while morning mist still clung to the water's surface like breath visible in winter air. The path through cottonwood groves had become so familiar that her feet found their way without guidance, from eyes that were busy scanning the landscape for any deviation from expected patterns. Birds called from branches overhead, their songs marking territorial boundaries and advertising for mates, concerned only with their own small dramas while human events unfolded beneath them. The flat rock where she always worked waited like a stage prepared for performance, its surface worn smooth by countless years of water flow and domestic labor. Nadira arranged her washing with deliberate care, positioning herself so that she would be clearly visible from the path Lydia would take during her morning inspection. The current flowed past with its customary patient strength, running deeper than casual observation suggested, hiding beneath its surface the kind of power that could pull down anyone who misjudged its force. Other women began arriving as dawn light strengthened, their greetings creating the familiar soundtrack of feminine voices that marked this space as territory claimed through daily labor. Hannah settled into her usual spot downstream, her movements slower than they had been years ago, but still efficient enough to satisfy even Lydia's critical eye. Ella and Chloe took their positions farther along the bank, their quiet conversation carrying across the water in fragments too incomplete to follow, but recognizable as the kind of talk that made hard work slightly more bearable. From the testimony of Mia Davis, free woman who worked at the creek that morning, everything seemed normal until Mrs. Taylor arrived. The enslaved woman Nadira was washing sheets at her usual place, showing no sign of agitation or unusual behavior. I noticed nothing that suggested what was about to occur, though looking back perhaps her stillness carried a quality of waiting rather than simple patience. Lydia appeared on the path at 6:10, 5 minutes earlier than her customary schedule, a deviation small enough that most people would have dismissed it as meaningless but significant enough that Nadira registered it immediately. The earlier arrival might indicate a change in mood, some domestic argument or restless night that had disrupted normal patterns. Or it might mean nothing beyond random variation in timing that only appeared meaningful because Nadira was watching for any detail that might affect her plans. The riding crop swung from Lydia's right hand with the casual menace that had become her signature gesture during these morning inspections, its presence announcing her authority before words established dominance through criticism and threat. She wore a pale blue dress that must have cost more than the combined annual wages of every free laborer in Thornhill Crossing, its elaborate construction requiring hours of skilled sewing that Lydia would never acknowledge as labor worthy of recognition or fair compensation. Her gaze swept across the working women with the expression of someone inspecting livestock for signs of disease or disobedience, lingering briefly on each figure before moving to the next. When her attention fixed on Nadira, something in her posture suggested that this morning's inspection would involve more than the usual arbitrary criticism. Perhaps Joseph had complained again about the cost of maintaining enslaved workers, or perhaps Lydia simply needed to reassert dominance that she felt slipping as summer advanced toward autumn and the territory's political situation grew increasingly uncertain. "You there," Lydia called, though everyone present knew exactly who she meant. "Those sheets show stains that proper washing would have removed. Bring them here so I can demonstrate the correct technique." The command was calculated humiliation, designed to force Nadira to carry wet laundry to where Lydia stood on the bank, and then watch as her mistress performed a theatrical demonstration of washing methods that would prove no more effective than what Nadira had already done. The performance would serve multiple audiences, reminding the enslaved women of their inferior status while showing free women that Lydia maintained proper discipline in her household. Nadira gathered the sheets she had been scrubbing, their weight increased by absorbed water until they required both arms to carry. She moved toward the bank with steps that appeared reluctant but were actually carefully measured to arrive at precisely the right location. The flat rock where she had been working was positioned near the deepest part of the creek's bend, where cottonwood roots created a hollow beneath the surface that couldn't be seen from the bank, but that Nadira had measured with her feet during weeks of preparation. She climbed out of the water onto the rocky bank, her dress clinging to her legs and water streaming from the sheet she carried. Lydia stood 3 feet back from the edge, maintaining the distance that marked her separation from manual labor, while still allowing her to supervise closely enough to find fault with any technique. "You clearly lack understanding of basic washing principles," Lydia announced, her voice carrying across the creek to reach every woman within hearing. "Perhaps your background simply doesn't include the capacity for learning proper domestic skills, or perhaps you choose laziness over diligence. Either way, the fault lies with you rather than with my instruction." The words were designed to wound pride and reinforce hierarchies that treated enslaved people as inherently inferior rather than systematically oppressed. Nadira had heard similar speeches countless times during 2 years of servitude, each one adding weight to the accumulated burden of insults that pretended to be observations about natural differences rather than acknowledgments of deliberately imposed cruelty. She stood holding the wet sheets while water pooled around her feet, creating a slick surface on rocks already made treacherous by moss and algae that grew wherever moisture collected. Lydia stepped closer to examine the laundry, her riding crop pointing at imaginary stains that existed only in her determination to find fault, regardless of actual evidence. What happened next would be described by witnesses in ways that varied depending on their position along the creek and their willingness to see what actually occurred versus what they preferred to believe. The physical facts were simple enough. Lydia stepped onto wet rocks made slippery by accumulated algae, her expensive shoes with their smooth leather soles providing no traction on the treacherous surface. She lost her balance with a sharp cry of surprise, her arms windmilling as she tried to regain stability that had already moved beyond recovery. Nadira's hands, still gripping the wet sheets, were positioned near enough that she could have grabbed Lydia's arm and prevented the fall. The distance between them was perhaps 18 inches, close enough that catching someone who stumbled should have been almost automatic. But automatic responses can be overridden by conscious choice, and the split second available for decision contained within it the accumulated weight of 2 years of systematic cruelty and degradation. Their eyes met for a fraction of a moment that seemed to stretch like hours, and in that brief connection Lydia finally saw what she had been too confident to recognize earlier: that the woman she had treated as property had retained the capacity for choice, and that this morning she was choosing not to prevent what gravity and momentum had already initiated. Lydia fell backward into the creek with a splash that sent water droplets flying through morning sunlight like scattered diamonds. The current caught her immediately, her heavy dress becoming an anchor that pulled her beneath the surface even as she struggled to find footing on the rocky bottom. The hollow where cottonwood roots created unexpected depth meant that her feet encountered nothing solid, while the current strength was sufficient to sweep away anyone who couldn't quickly establish stable position. She surfaced once, gasping, and reaching toward the bank where Nadira stood motionless, still holding the wet sheets. Her mouth opened to scream for help, but water rushed in before sound could emerge, and then the current pulled her under again, carrying her toward the deeper section where the creek bent around massive boulders that had tumbled from the mountains centuries earlier. From the testimony of Abigail Anderson, free woman working 30 yards downstream, I heard the splash and looked up to see Mrs. Taylor in the water. The enslaved woman on the bank made no move to help, just stood there watching as if she were observing something that didn't concern her. By the time I understood what was happening and called for others to help, Mrs. Taylor had been carried out of reach. The other women along the creek reacted with the confusion natural to people witnessing unexpected events, their minds requiring several seconds to process that someone was drowning in water they had all been working in moments before. Hannah dropped her washing and moved toward the disturbance, but the current had already carried Lydia 20 yards downstream, her struggles growing weaker as cold water and heavy clothing combined to exhaust strength that frontier life had never required her to develop. Ella and Chloe reached the water's edge just as Lydia surfaced for the final time, her face pale as moonlight and her eyes showing the terrible understanding that death was arriving not through dramatic violence, but through simple physics of water pressure and insufficient oxygen. She went under without the scream that witnesses would later claim to remember, her body carried by current that had no investment in human dramas of power and revenge. Nadira remained on the bank, her face showing no more emotion than it had displayed during 2 years of enduring punishment and humiliation. The sheets she still held dripped water onto rocks, already wet from the creek's natural flow, and when Marshall Freeman would later ask what she had been thinking during those crucial seconds, she would answer with perfect honesty that she had been thinking about nothing at all, that her mind had been as blank as winter sky just before snow begins to fall. What would you have done standing in that moment with power suddenly shifted and choice suddenly available? Would instinct have pushed you toward rescue? Or would accumulated injustice have frozen your hands and allowed nature to complete what human law would never address? The distance between action and inaction can be measured in seconds or lifetimes depending on whose perspective you accept as valid. The creek swallowed Lydia Caldwell with the efficiency of water that had been carving stone for thousands of years, her body disappearing around the bend, where rapids tumbled over rocks before flowing into the deeper pools beyond. The women gathered along the bank, stood frozen in postures that reflected shock, mixing with something more complicated, a recognition that the power structure governing their daily lives had just shifted in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. Marshall Cole Freeman arrived within the hour, summoned by one of the ranch hands who had been working near enough to hear the commotion. He examined the scene with the methodical attention of someone who understood that frontier justice required evidence substantial enough to overcome the natural reluctance of communities to acknowledge violence among their own members. The wet rocks near where Lydia had fallen showed clear signs of algae growth that would make footing treacherous for anyone wearing smooth-soled shoes designed for parlors rather than creek banks. Freeman questioned each woman present with questions that probed for inconsistencies in their accounts, without directly accusing anyone of deliberate action. The testimonies aligned with remarkable consistency. Mrs. Taylor had arrived for her morning inspection, had stepped too close to the water's edge while examining laundry, and had lost her footing on slippery rocks. The current had caught her before anyone could react, carrying her downstream with the swift inevitability of gravity acting en masse in water. "Did anyone attempt to help her?" Freeman asked, his gaze moving across the assembled women with the careful neutrality of someone who suspected more than he could prove. "By the time we understood what was happening, she was already too far gone," Mia Davis replied, her voice carrying the shaken quality appropriate to someone who had witnessed unexpected death. "The current runs strong in that section, and her dress pulled her down faster than any of us could have moved to reach her." Freeman's attention settled on Nadira, who stood apart from the other women with the same composed expression she had maintained since Lydia's body disappeared beneath the water. Her stillness carried a quality that made the marshal uneasy without providing specific reason for suspicion. She had been closest to Lydia when the fall occurred, positioned where she might have prevented the accident if she had acted with sufficient speed. "You were holding laundry when Mrs. Taylor fell," Freeman said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Your hands were occupied, preventing you from reaching out to catch her." "Yes, Marshal," Nadira replied, her voice steady and her eyes meeting his without the downcast deference usually displayed by enslaved people questioned by white authorities. "The sheets were heavy with water. By the time I could have dropped them and moved to help, she was already beyond reach." The explanation was plausible enough that Freeman could find no immediate flaw in its logic, yet something in Nadira's tone suggested she understood the subtext of his questions better than most witnesses would have. She was describing events in terms that emphasized physical constraints rather than emotional reactions, presenting her inaction as inevitable consequence of circumstances rather than choice influenced by 2 years of systematic abuse. From Marshal Freeman's official report, August 3, 1852, death appears consistent with accidental drowning. Multiple witnesses confirm victim lost footing on slippery rocks and was carried away by current before assistance could be rendered. No evidence of foul play visible at scene. Recommend ruling of misadventure pending recovery of body and examination by territorial physician. Joseph Taylor arrived at the creek within 2 hours of his wife's disappearance, his face showing the complex emotions of someone confronting loss mixed with recognition that his life had just become simultaneously simpler and more complicated. Lydia had been difficult in ways that made their marriage a source of tension rather than comfort, yet her death would require explanations to her Richmond family and raise questions about his household management that could affect his standing in the territory. He questioned the enslaved women with an anger born from grief, mixing with the uncomfortable awareness that he bore responsibility for placing valuable property in situations where accidents could occur. His investment in Nadira and the others represented significant capital that would be wasted if any were implicated in circumstances that might be interpreted as suspicious by authorities inclined to see conspiracy rather than misfortune. "You stood there and watched my wife drown," Joseph said, his voice tight with accusation as he confronted Nadira away from the other witnesses. "You could have saved her if you had acted immediately." "I was holding wet sheets that blocked my movement," Nadira replied, maintaining the same steady composure that had characterized her testimony to Marshal Freeman. "The rocks were slippery and the current was strong. By the time I understood what was happening, she was already beyond anyone's reach." Joseph stared at her with a frustrated expression of someone who suspected truth was being withheld, but lacked evidence sufficient to challenge the narrative being constructed by multiple witnesses whose testimonies aligned with uncomfortable consistency. The simplest explanation, that his wife had died through a combination of poor footing and unfortunate timing, would satisfy authorities reluctant to investigate accidents that might reveal negligence by prominent citizens. The recovery of Lydia's body 3 hours later confirmed what witnesses had described. Her corpse showed no signs of violence beyond bruises, consistent with being tumbled over rocks by swift current. The territorial physician who examined her concluded that death had resulted from drowning, with no evidence suggesting anything beyond tragic accident. The scratches on her arms appeared consistent with desperate attempts to find purchase on rocks and roots while being swept downstream. Settlement gossip, always swift to find patterns in random events, began circulating theories that ranged from divine judgment to supernatural intervention. Some whispered that Lydia's cruelty had finally earned the punishment that earthly authorities had been unwilling to impose. Others suggested that enslaved workers possessed powers beyond what civilized people understood. dark knowledge brought from heathen lands and applied with patience that waited years for appropriate moments of revenge. The more practical voices in Thornhill Crossing noted that accidents happened with unfortunate regularity on the frontier, where civilization's protective structures remained thin enough that nature could reclaim lives with casual efficiency. Women drowned in creeks, men died beneath spooked horses, families succumbed to diseases that would have been survivable with proper medical care. Lydia's death fit patterns familiar enough that accepting accident required less effort than investigating possibilities that would force uncomfortable examinations of the territory's social foundations. What would your community have concluded witnessing such events? Would you have accepted the obvious explanation, or would you have recognized the spaces between testimony and truth where justice existed in forms that official law could never acknowledge or address? Joseph made his decision within 3 days of burying his wife in the small cemetery that served Thornhill Crossing's respectable families. He would sell the enslaved workers whose presence now reminded him of circumstances he preferred to forget, whose continued residence in his household raised questions he lacked answers for that satisfied his own doubts. The decision was practical rather than moral, motivated by desire to eliminate complications rather than acknowledge injustice. The sale notice appeared in the settlement's general store on August 10th, posted among advertisements for cattle auctions and mining equipment, with the casual efficiency of commerce that treated human beings as merchandise requiring disposal. For sale, 5 enslaved persons healthy and trained in household duties. Inquiries to Joseph Taylor, Copper Ridge Ranch. Sale to proceed August 20th. Immediate removal required. The announcement sent different ripples through different segments of Thornhill Crossing's population. Those who profited from enslaved labor saw opportunity to acquire trained workers at prices potentially reduced by Joseph's obvious eagerness to complete the transaction quickly. Abolition sympathizers recognized another instance of human commodification that violated principles they expressed quietly in private conversations, but rarely acted upon in public spaces. The enslaved workers themselves understood that sale meant separation from the only community they knew, dispersal to unknown masters whose cruelty might prove worse than what they had already endured. Nadira received the news with the same composed expression that had become her signature response to circumstances beyond her control. She had expected consequences to follow Lydia's death, understanding that Joseph would need to distance himself from events that raised uncomfortable questions, regardless of official rulings about accidental drowning. Sale represented better outcome than she might have hoped for during her first months of planning, when possibilities had included her own death as acceptable price for achieving justice. Hannah found her sitting by the window on the evening after the sale notice appeared, staring toward Sweetwater Creek where morning light would soon bring another day of washing clothes in water that had claimed Lydia Caldwell just days earlier. The older woman settled beside her with the careful movements of someone whose body had been worn down by 4 decades of labor that exceeded any reasonable measure of what one person should be required to endure. "You're thinking about running," Hannah said quietly, making it a statement rather than a question. "Thinking that sale to unknown masters is worse than taking chances on the road north." Nadira didn't deny the observation, understanding that Hannah had survived 40 years through ability to read intentions that others tried to hide. The idea of escape had been growing since the sale notice appeared, fed by recognition that circumstances would never again align as favorably as they did in this moment when attention was focused on Lydia's death, rather than on monitoring enslaved workers whose value had just become measured in immediate profit, rather than long-term investment. "The territory grows more uncertain every month," Nadira replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some say Colorado will enter the Union as free territory within 5 years. Others insist slavery will expand westward regardless of political debates in Washington. Either way, waiting for freedom to arrive through legal channels seems less certain than creating it through action." From the private correspondence of Reverend Matthew Moore, August 12, 1852, the enslaved woman Nadira displays remarkable composure given recent events and impending sale. "I attempted to offer spiritual counsel but found her more interested in discussing territorial politics and legal precedents regarding slavery's expansion. Her education exceeds anything appropriate for her station, suggesting either remarkable natural intelligence or instruction from sources that remain mysterious." The Underground Railroad operated in the Colorado Territory with the same careful secrecy that characterized its work throughout regions where slavery existed in legal ambiguity. Networks of sympathetic settlers, motivated by religious conviction or political principle, provided assistance to freedom seekers willing to risk everything for the possibility of reaching states where slavery had been abolished. The journey required crossing hundreds of miles of terrain that could kill even experienced travelers, avoiding slave catchers whose financial incentives made them persistent hunters, and maintaining hope through weeks of traveling at night while hiding during daylight hours. Nadira spent the days before the scheduled sale gathering information with the same systematic approach she had applied to planning Lydia's death. She learned which settlers might provide assistance, which routes offered the best combination of cover and water access, which towns along the way were known to be hostile to freedom seekers, and which might offer temporary sanctuary. The knowledge accumulated like supplies packed for a journey whose success would depend on preparation meeting opportunity at precisely the right moment. The night of August 18th arrived with the kind of darkness that occurs when clouds obscure moon and stars, creating conditions ideal for movement that required concealment. Nadira waited until the ranch house settled into the deep silence that comes after midnight, when even restless sleepers have finally surrendered to exhaustion. She carried nothing except a small bundle containing bread stolen from the kitchen, a knife taken from the barn, and the journal she had kept hidden beneath floorboards throughout her time in the territory. Hannah was waiting by the barn when Nadira emerged from the house, her presence both expected and deeply moving. The older woman pressed something into Nadira's hand, a small leather pouch that contained coins saved over years of occasional payments that Joseph had provided for work beyond regular duties. The amount was modest, perhaps $5 in total, but it represented wealth that could purchase food or transportation at crucial moments. "You go north and you don't look back," Hannah said, her voice rough with emotions that 40 years of slavery had not entirely crushed. "You find freedom, and you remember those of us who never will. You make our suffering mean something by living the life we never got to have." Nadira embraced the older woman with a fierceness that contained gratitude mixing with grief for all the years Hannah had endured, and would continue enduring until death provided the only escape available to those who remained enslaved. Then she turned toward the darkness beyond the ranch buildings and began walking with steps that grew more confident as distance increased between her present location and the place that had consumed 2 years of her life. The journey north would take 6 weeks, covering terrain that tested every skill she had developed through years of survival in hostile circumstances. She traveled at night and hid during daylight hours, following the North Star with the faith of someone who understood that hope without action produced nothing except continued bondage. She encountered assistance from unexpected sources, settlers who provided meals or shelter, despite risks to their own safety, and she evaded dangers that included slave catchers, hostile weather, and the simple challenge of crossing wilderness that cared nothing for human dramas of freedom and captivity. Marshal Freeman organized a search party that operated for 3 days before abandoning the effort as unlikely to succeed. Joseph Taylor posted reward notices offering $50 for Nadira's capture and return, but the amount was insufficient to motivate serious pursuit across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. The official record would eventually list her as "fugitive, whereabouts unknown," a notation that reduced years of lived experience to bureaucratic acknowledgement that property had escaped inventory. The other enslaved workers were sold on August 20th as scheduled, dispersed to different owners throughout the territory. Hannah went to a rancher 30 miles north, Ella and Chloe, to a mining operation in the mountains, each woman carrying forward the story of someone who had chosen freedom over continued submission, whose successful escape provided hope that circumstances were not as fixed as they sometimes appeared. What would you have felt? Watching someone risk everything for the possibility of freedom, would you have provided assistance despite potential consequences, or would you have maintained the safe distance that preserved your own security while leaving others to face dangers alone? The Colorado Territory continued its transformation from frontier wilderness to organized society, its future status regarding slavery remaining uncertain until political decisions made in distant capitals would finally resolve questions that territorial residents debated with increasing passion. But for one woman walking north through darkness toward an uncertain future, those debates had already been settled through actions that recognized justice as something created rather than granted by authorities, whose legitimacy depended on systems she had rejected, along with everything else slavery represented. Nadira crossed into free territory on the morning of September 29, 1852, her feet touching soil where the law recognized her as a person rather than property for the first time in her conscious memory. The moment carried less dramatic weight than she had imagined during the long weeks of travel, arriving not as thunderous revelation but as quiet recognition that the landscape surrounding her operated according to different rules than those governing the Colorado territory she had left behind. The air smelled the same, the sun warmed her face with identical heat, but the legal framework defining her existence had transformed in ways both profound and invisible. The journey north had worn her down to essentials, stripping away everything except the determination that had sustained her through 6 weeks of night walking and daylight hiding. Her dress hung loose on a frame that had lost weight it could not afford to spare, her shoes had disintegrated until she wrapped her feet in cloth torn from her hem, and her face had been weathered by sun and wind until she looked a decade older than her 20 years. But her eyes retained the intelligence that had always marked her as dangerous to those who preferred their enslaved workers docile and unthinking. She found work in a small town whose name she would later struggle to remember, taking employment as a laundress for wages that seemed impossibly generous after years of unpaid labor. The irony of washing clothes for money in free territory after washing them under threat of punishment in Colorado was not lost on her, but she understood that freedom meant choosing one's own exploitation rather than having it imposed through violence and legal bondage. The distinction mattered more than outsiders might recognize. From the journal Nadira continued keeping after reaching free territory, October 15, 1852. Today marks 2 months since I watched Lydia Caldwell drown in Sweetwater Creek. I feel neither guilt nor satisfaction, only the quiet recognition that some debts can only be settled through actions that civilized society condemns, but that justice ultimately requires. She would have sold me south eventually, separating me from everyone I knew, and sending me to plantations where survival measured in years rather than decades. I chose to survive on my own terms instead. News from the Colorado Territory arrived sporadically through newspapers that made their way north along the same routes freedom seekers traveled. She learned that Joseph Taylor had remarried within a year, selecting a bride from Denver whose family connections enhanced his business prospects without bringing Lydia's demands for social refinement that had made his first marriage so contentious. The new Mrs. Taylor apparently ran the household with efficient practicality rather than cruel perfectionism, treating the enslaved workers Joseph had replaced with basic competence rather than systematic brutality. Marshal Freeman's investigation into Lydia's death had concluded with the official ruling of accidental drowning, the case closed with bureaucratic finality that recognized no ambiguity between legal conclusions and actual truth. The settlement had absorbed the scandal with the resilience communities develop when confronted with events that challenge comfortable assumptions, gradually incorporating Lydia's death into local mythology as cautionary tale about the dangers of frontier life, rather than as examination of the cruelties that had defined her relationship with those she claimed to own. Some stories from Thornhill Crossing suggested that the creek where Lydia drowned had acquired a reputation for supernatural presence, with travelers reporting glimpses of a woman in pale blue dress standing among the cottonwood trees at dawn. Others claimed to hear screams carried on the wind during storms, though whether these represented Lydia's ghost, or simply the projected guilt of a community that had tolerated evil because confronting it would have required uncomfortable self-examination, remained a matter of interpretation. Hannah had died in the winter of 1853, succumbing to pneumonia at the age of 42 after a lifetime of labor that had consumed her strength without providing the basic medical care that might have saved her. The news reached Nadira through networks that connected the formerly enslaved across vast distances, informal communication systems that tracked births and deaths, successes and tragedies, maintaining connections that slavery had tried to sever but never quite succeeded in destroying completely. The grief Nadira felt at Hannah's passing mixed with relief that the older woman's suffering had finally ended, that she had escaped through death the bondage she would never have escaped through law or flight. She attended a memorial service at the small church that served the town's community of formerly enslaved people, listening to testimonies about resilience and faith that felt both true and inadequate to capture the full weight of lives consumed by institutions that treated human beings as equipment requiring occasional maintenance but no fundamental respect. From a letter Nadira wrote to a friend in 1855, 3 years after reaching free territory, People sometimes ask if I regret what happened at the creek that morning. They expect me to express guilt or to claim I acted without conscious thought. But I remember every detail with perfect clarity. I chose not to save her the same way she had chosen to torment me for 2 years. The difference is that my choice was made in response to systematic cruelty, while hers was made from a position of absolute power. I will not apologize for surviving in a world that gave me no other options. The Colorado Territory's status regarding slavery remained uncertain until 1861, when the outbreak of civil war forced political decisions that had been deferred for over a decade. The territory entered the Union as a free state in 1876, officially ending the institution that had shaped Nadira's early life and claimed so many years from people like Hannah, who never lived, to see legal recognition of their fundamental humanity. The transformation came too late for those who had already died in bondage, but it represented victory nonetheless for those who had fought through resistance, both open and hidden. Nadira lived to see that transformation, building a life in free territory that included marriage, work as a teacher in schools for formerly enslaved people, and quiet activism in causes that challenged racial discrimination even in states where slavery had been abolished. She never returned to the Colorado Territory, understanding that some places held memories too heavy to carry while moving forward into uncertain futures that required focusing attention on possibilities rather than dwelling on past traumas. She told her story selectively, sharing details with those she trusted, while maintaining silence about specific events that could still provoke legal consequences despite years of distance. The question of whether she had deliberately allowed Lydia to drown remained officially unanswered, existing in the ambiguous space between accident and action, where truth could be interpreted according to the moral framework observers brought to their evaluation. What would you conclude about that morning at Sweetwater Creek? Would you judge Nadira's choice as murder, requiring condemnation, or as justice enacted by someone who had been systematically denied access to legal remedies for systematic abuse? The answer depends on whether you believe that laws protecting slavery deserved the obedience usually owed to legitimate authority, or whether resistance to evil institutions justified actions that transcended conventional morality. Even today, visitors to the region around Thornhill Crossing report seeing a woman in a faded blue dress walking along creek banks at dawn, her movement purposeful as she travels toward destinations that exist beyond the reach of earthly jurisdiction. The story has entered local folklore as ghost tale rather than historical account, transformed through retelling into entertainment that obscures the brutal realities of slavery's existence in territories that preferred to imagine themselves as somehow exempt from the institution's worst manifestations. But for those who study the fragmentary records that survive from 1852, who read between lines of official reports and private correspondence, who trace the networks of resistance that operated beneath the surface of frontier settlements, the truth remains accessible to anyone willing to acknowledge that justice sometimes requires actions that civilized society condemns. Nadira's choice to let Lydia drown was both completely understandable and impossible to justify within legal frameworks that treated enslaved people as property rather than persons, creating moral complexity that cannot be resolved through simple declarations of right and wrong. The Sweetwater Creek continues its patient flow toward the sea, carrying stories that will never be fully told alongside water that eventually reaches every shore. And in communities from Colorado to California, descendants of enslaved people hear whispered tales of a woman who faced her oppressor without flinching, who turned the tools of daily labor into instruments of liberation, who vanished into legend like smoke dissolving into mountain air, leaving behind questions about justice and revenge that each generation must answer according to its own understanding of what human beings owe to one another when laws fail to protect the vulnerable from those who wield power without conscience. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.